Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be back. I don't come to Karachi as often as I used to in days gone by. But as was, this was mentioned, 50 years ago, it's another reason why it's a great pleasure for me to be here. About 50 years ago, MAP hosted a speech by one of Pakistan's great personalities, and this was Dr. Mahbubul Haq, who was the then finance minister later on and became, earlier in his life, when he was in his 20s in fact, he was the chief economist to the Planning Commission. And it was in his speech in April 1968 to what was then the West Pakistan Management Association, so the predecessor body to MAP. This was the arena where he gave his very famous, or should I say infamous, 22 families speech. This was the speech which perhaps some of you a little bit younger than I am may not know. It was the speech in which he made the famous claim that a small number of families are responsible for quite large shares of the industrial sectors that were quoted on the Karachi Stock Exchange. And I'm not going to sort of step onto any further landmines in terms of the rights and wrongs of his argument, but it was here where that address was made in April 1968. And as was mentioned, I needed to try and find the text of that speech, and it was Salahuddin, in fact, who helped me to locate it for my book, which is here. It's called The Great Invention, and it's a story of how GDP became the world's preeminent economic indicator. Now you're probably wondering, why did I need to locate that particular speech in the context of GDP? And the reason is that Pakistan was one of the, if not the main laboratory in the 1950s for testing out the idea of economic growth. Economic growth, as measured by GDP, is about 80 years old, but its international application really only got going in the 50s. And economists around the world who were developing it were looking for a country fairly new in its existence, which didn't have a lot of baggage and didn't have a huge amount of infrastructure, and they could actually test out growth methodology. And so the Planning Commission, then headed by the former State Bank Governor, Mr. Zahid Hussain, and his very young chief economist, Mahbubul Haq, they were approached by the University of Harvard, and Harvard sent in a small advisory group, and they set up an office just a few miles down the road from here in, I think it was called Drigg Colony. And they spent 4 years helping the early Ministry of Finance and the Planning Commission on some of their growth, their ideas about growth. So come 1968, and Mahbubul Haq is sort of standing on a podium a little bit like this, and he is, of course, expected to be celebrating a decade of quite high rates of growth, 6%, 5%, 7%, 8% in 1 year. And of course, that's not what he does, and which is how the speech became so controversial. That's not what he did at all. In fact, if you read the text, and I would encourage you, because Mohammed Salah and the MAP colleagues have found the speech, and so I'd encourage you all to read that text, because he asked his audience, he said, at one level we've got quite high rates of economic growth, and so Pakistan has become an international poster child for growth-related policy making. But open your curtains, look outside, step out onto the street. Are roads how they should be? Are schools how they should be? Are people doing jobs in the way that they should be? Is there healthcare in the way that it should be? So on those measures, on those metrics, we're not doing at all where we need to be. And yet somehow we're posting growth rates of 6% and 7%, and it's all looking like it's a great success story. And of course, this was the beginnings of what would then become the Human Development Index, which he then co-founded with the Indian economist Amartya Sen. But again, just to go back to the Management Association, or the West Pakistan Management Association, a lot of the thinking around that was culminated. A lot of the thinking that you will find now in the Human Development Index and the Human Development reports around the world, it's a sort of 7 or 8 page, very short speech, and it's called, as was mentioned, a critical review of the third five-year plan, but a lot of the thinking in that sort of happened here. So, with that little bit of history over, I was asked by Faisal, and if he's here, I said, what would your members like me to talk about? My I'm not a management person in that sense. I've been, for the last sort of 22 years, a journalist in the world of science policy, which is, I'm a sort of minority within a minority, and I've spent most of my working life working for a couple of publications, but one of those is mostly the journal Nature. And in the late 1990s, I was based here covering the sort of South Asia region. So that's really my forte, is the relationship between science and universities and innovation and government policies around the world. And so Faisal said, well, can I talk about, do I have sort of, reflections, perspectives on how things are? And of course, as you know, we have a new government in place, which is going to make what look like quite significant changes in terms of the policy-making landscape. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll talk about how that fits into some sort of more global developments. So for the first time that I probably had a really good look at sort of science and innovation in Pakistan was a long time ago. It was in 1995, 96. And looking on at that time, you had a prime minister who had a degree from Oxford, and you had no minister in the Ministry of Science and Technology. And so it is with some extraordinary irony that I come back, more than 20 years later, and there is a prime minister with a degree from the University of Oxford, and there is no minister in the Ministry of Science and Technology. Although if you read this morning's papers, there is the hot tip is Mr. Ehsan Masood. I don't know who he is. I believe he's been a minister before, but he is tipped, very widely tipped to be the new minister. He also gave a long interview for one of the newspapers about a week ago, and it felt like he'd already been given the job. So I wonder if he knows something that the rest of us don't. The other things that, some sort of salient points from that period, 1995, you had about 20-ish universities. Today there are 192, and there are 5, possibly 6, which are either in or on the threshold of joining the global rankings. You have a much bigger source of funding in the Higher Education Commission, which is also your regulator. That didn't exist in the 90s. There's been an absolutely phenomenal increase in female enrollment, both at the level of students, but also at the level of faculty. And there are many things that I could add on. There are, of course, challenges, both for this government, but also for its predecessors. And I'm just going to talk about 2 of those challenges. One of those is the challenge of quality, and the other is the challenge of business and community engagement. I think as employers, all of you are employers, I've been an employer before, I'm not one at the moment. I think everyone recognizes that the large public universities, the places where most of your staff will go to get educated, there is a real quality deficit in the public university system. And so a few months ago when Dr. Tariq Banouri was appointed the chairman of the HEC, just in one of the last acts of the previous government, I had quite a long chat with him, and I said, well, Tariq, what are you going to be doing in this job that you probably weren't expecting you would get? And he completely gets the point that if more than 9 out of 10 young people is being educated in a public sector university, then the focus of any reform effort to improve quality needs to be within that sector and not necessarily within the commercial sector. When, of course, a lot of the innovation has been happening in the commercial sector. But the commercial sector does not educate the vast majority of this nation's children. So I think for Tariq, a big push very likely will be, certainly in terms of what he wants to do, is to take a really forensic look inside the public university system and understand why is there a quality deficit. I think it's not a small task, as you would know, otherwise previous administrations would probably have tried to do something with it. I'm also a little concerned, I think, that he probably may well end up getting quite bogged down in the politics of education, and there are already some early signs where that might be happening. Previous chairs of HEC, of the Higher Education Commission, were quite fortunate in at least one respect, politically, and this is that they had very strong defenders very high up in the political food chain, whether it was Sohail Naqvi and his relationship to Ahsan Iqbal and so on and so forth. You would know about this better than I would. I think the problem, one of the difficulties now, is that higher education is very clearly not a stated policy priority for the incoming PTI government. And already, as you know, the public sector development budget, which HEC derives a lot of its kind of non-core funding from, has already been cut. And there's quite a lot of evidence that projects that have been approved but where funds have not been disbursed will probably face delays. Projects that might have been approved but have not yet are probably going to get cancelled. And that's a kind of early sign that the direction of travel in terms of higher education policy making probably isn't quite what it was under at least the previous PMLN administration. The other big gap, of course, in terms of quality is in HR, is in human resources. And as many of you will know, when Professor Ataur Rahman was the HEC chairman, particularly in the General Musharraf years, one of his policies was to provide opportunities for thousands of young people to be paid to go and undertake PhD training abroad. And they went to the United Kingdom, elsewhere in the European Union, they went to the United States, they went to Latin America, and they went to the countries of Southeast Asia. It was, of course, a very controversial policy because a lot of thought wasn't given to what would happen when they come back. They were just expected to return and stay here for 5 years. But then in terms of their reabsorption into the system, there wasn't a huge amount of planning. Now that, for those of you, I'm sure you know him much better than I do. This was never really a concern because he realized that he has a rare window of opportunity where a large amount of money has been made available to him, courtesy of his relationship to General Musharraf. And he's just going to use that to do whatever he can and very quickly in the quickest amount of time. And that is to just interview a lot of young people who are very bright and then just get them on their way. And of course he did that partly because that's how he trained himself. He went to Cambridge, and very much everyone else in his generation had some time spent abroad. The problem, of course, was that after that generation of the people who went to the UK and elsewhere via what was then known as the Colombo Plan or the Commonwealth Plan, there was like a big hiatus. There was a 20-25-year gap when the universities here were either not allowed to or not funded to or not incentivized to have anyone go abroad. And so you had a sort of period of a small number of universities being run by some very talented people who've had overseas experience and training. Then you've had your expansion period of universities, and in that time, they're all being run by people who have not had that international experience. And I think Atta understood that really well, and he tried to make a difference. Problem, of course, is that you've got some people at the very top who do not have that experience. Then you have a middle group who don't have a lot of experience, and then you've got a very large reservoir of very young people who are really hungry to do things because they've been abroad and they've seen what it's like to be in a more autonomous higher education system. And they are very frustrated, and that, I think, is a potential challenge that needs to be adopted. When it comes to the challenge of quality, it's also true, and this is something where I think this government is going to try and do something. Quite what, I really don't know, is the lower end of what's called the pyramid sometimes. So primary and secondary education, which is a feeder into higher education, and of course, the state of primary and secondary education is what it is, and I think there's going to be some efforts to do that. I think the second big challenge is to enable universities, and again, focusing very much on the public universities, is to encourage them somehow to look outwards as well as inwards. There are very good reasons why universities exist inside campuses, and of course, one of those is just the ability to be sort of shut out of society, to be able to focus and concentrate on whatever it is that you're doing in terms of discovery or learning or invention. The downside, of course, is that campuses have walls, and they have doors and locks, and it means that those of us who are outside of the universities or academic world find it difficult to penetrate. We can't go inside, and universities kind of like it that way because it allows them to sort of do things the way they've always been doing it, and it's not a very conducive environment for change or for innovation. There is, as all of you will know, a big, and there has been a big worldwide push to get universities to break down some of those walls, to lower those walls, to dismantle those walls. And there's a big push for students and for faculty to work with their communities, with think tanks, with campaigning organizations, with governments, and of course, there's an absolutely extraordinarily big push to get them to work with businesses. Globally now, universities are seen as engines for growth. And of course, here in Pakistan, there is no exception. So in 2011, the HEC, your regulator, the Higher Education Commission, they encouraged all universities, both in the public and in the private sector, to establish an office for commercialization, research, and innovation. And it goes by the acronym of ORIC, O-R-I-C. Can I just take a show of hands? Who in this room has heard of, who knows what an ORIC is? This Office of Research, Innovation, Commercialization. Okay, there are a few hands. It's more encouraging than I thought. I thought it'd be zero, but That's not a bad start. So there are now about 70 of these offices, and they've been going, as I said, since 2011. These offices, of course, they do face themselves significant challenges, and one of those is that they've been completely mired in the bureaucracy of the universities. Universities have set them up because they get a funding uplift by establishing the office, and for some research grants or some grants, they get up to 15% more than what they ask for if they establish this ORIC. So it's seen as a form of free money, and the universities have established them. But beyond that, they're really, really struggling, and both struggling in terms of ideas and what they want to do, and they're also struggling in terms of the resistance that you're seeing, particularly amongst some senior faculty. So the tradition of university autonomy, which of course is an important one, is one reason why one big problem is emerging with the 70 institutions that have ORICs, and this is that entrepreneurs are not allowed to play a leading role. In fact, in some cases, entrepreneurs are simply not allowed to come in at all. Yesterday, I was with a gentleman who's going to be speaking here later in the afternoon, Yusuf Hussain, who runs the absolutely fantastic National Incubation Center Network. And I know from speaking to Yusuf and from other colleagues of his that there is a real frustration from many of you in this room, but also from even within the NIC network, that universities are not particularly welcoming places, even though they have these offices for research, innovation, and collaboration. So I just really want to end in the last few minutes by, perhaps a few words of advice, if I can. I think one is that these offices that have been established shows that universities are mandated by their regulator to go out and interface with the business community. Now, a lot of people in the business community don't know these offices exist, which in itself is a bit of a travesty. But perhaps now that you know about them, I would encourage you to find out what they are. And if you have a university in your hometown or in your city, or perhaps in your province, knock on the door and find out what this office is and what it does. And I think the more of you who do that, because right now the relationship is very one way, and there's no incentive for the university other than to set up the office to actually engage with business. But if you were to go in, and more of you were to go in, and your colleagues and your networks, and say, hey, we want to do stuff with you, whatever it might be, for profit, not for profit, it could be consulting, it could be startups, it could be spin-outs, it could be contract research, it could be real estate. I think universities will find it difficult to resist if you've got an offer for them. And I'm very much hoping, I'm on a little bit of a mission, I hope that the National Incubation Centres themselves will, I think in an ideal situation, they ought to be taking over and running these bodies, because they'll do much better than the public sector. Although there is a worldwide push to have universities contribute to industry and to growth, the city you're in here, and this is really my last point, the city you're in is a great example of the reverse. And I've always been struck by, every time I visited, that here you've got some really good examples of businesses that recognize the needs themselves to invest in higher education and in research. Whether it's NED or DJ or Daoud or the others, these are the kinds of examples that we don't have in Britain. We don't have philanthropy in business, establishing institutions of higher education or learning in the way that you have here. And it's interesting to see that tradition with Habib is continuing. And so I'm kind of wondering whether, if there is to be a funding squeeze on the HEC, and if the priority for the PTI-led government is going to be technical training and primary education and secondary education, I'm sort of wondering whether universities might sort of become a little bit at a loose end. And I'm almost wondering whether that may be a point at which philanthropy might, once again, need to sort of step up. The government does say it wants to invest in healthcare and in basic education, but the public finances are not in good shape. And given the situation with the public finances, and given the fact that education is devolved, and given the other problems, this sort of may all end up becoming a little bit too much for HEC to actually make progress in the end. There is an argument that some people in politics make, which is that higher education benefits the relatively privileged, and there is some evidence that people with university degrees earn more than those without them, in terms of lifetime of earnings. And if this argument has supporters in Islamabad, then that may well also be a reason to go slow on higher education expansion. So while the title of this talk is very much about new perspectives, I would encourage you all to not lose sight of one of the older ideas that you've had and which has served this city and this country very well. And I hope that members of MAP and your supporters engage with your universities in the many ways that you can. There is an open door, and yes, there are hurdles, of course, but I think anyone who knows anything about business also knows that an obstacle is often an opportunity. Thank you.